Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Members, Mike Dillon representing the California Library Association, and live the discussion. We'll try to shorten things up, but I think you can see based on the comments from Mr. McGinnity and Mr. Keller and Mr. Fox here why we're excited about scenic. But we're in strong support of the proposal. We'd like to thank the Governor and Director of Finance, Michael Cohen, for having the vision to put it in there, and also thank this committee because last year you put the money in, as did the Senate, and unfortunately was knocked out in the final stages. But you put language in requiring an assessment by the State Library, and we think that big, thick document has just been very helpful. We'd like to compliment Mr. Martin on his analysis. It's excellent. But the bottom line here is admittedly, just like schools, there are some libraries maybe for years might not be able to take advantage of this, but we think somewhere in the neighborhood of 80% of the libraries after July 2nd, if this is put into the budget, are going to be able to go forward. There will be some libraries, admittedly, maybe 20% or so, that are going to need some help, and there is a little bit of money in the budget for that last mile and those types of related things. A lot of work to do, but this is our number one priority. As I've said to some of you personally, 40% of the libraries have speed that's slower than our home. That's nuts, especially when kids get out of school and the library directors tell us that at some of our meetings everything just kind of grinds to a halt. And you know all the uses that they have. I see Ms. Skinner nodding. So finally, Mr. Chair and members, it should not be lost, you've heard me say this before, that in 2000 the state was providing us $85 million for 3 different programs. That money is now $4.7 million. We're not asking for a huge amount of money here. We think this small amount of money will have huge benefits, not just for the libraries, but the millions of Californians that use the libraries annually. Thank you. Now I'd like to just introduce Linda Crow again, who just had an additional brief comment or two.
Well, I just would like to make a comment to thank Scenic for letting us be the pilot library. We are very pleased, and we have very happy communities. We aren't getting any more complaints about how slow our network is. So I think Scenic is a game changer for the library community.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Patrick Perry. I'm the Vice Chancellor of Technology for the California Community College System, and I'm also the Vice Chair of the Scenic Board. The Scenic Board, consisting of all the educational segments, CSU, CCC, UC, K-12, Stanford, USC, and Caltech, both endorse and welcome the proposed addition of the public libraries onto the shared network. I can speak from my own experience as being a member of Scenic for over 15 years. We can attest to the cost-effective nature of the network for us. All of our collective costs have been reduced over time. Our bandwidth has been greatly increased over time. The quality of service has been very, very good for us simply because Scenic is a nonprofit entity and their sole purpose and function is to serve the educational institutions that are on our network. Adding libraries is embraced by our institutions because we see a synergistic relationship with libraries, both as an access point to information and also an access point for current and prospective students. It also creates a more efficient network design for us. We can create more local rings of traffic and thus limit the potential for downtime on the network. The network should have no issues with the additional network traffic placed upon it. And from a governance standpoint, we totally welcome the addition of the libraries as a full charter member with the same equal representation on the board. There really should be no divergence of interest between libraries and the educational segments. So once again, we fully support this proposal and urge its approval. Thank you.
All right. Any comments or questions from the committee? So it appears to me. Oh, did you? Okay, go ahead.
Jennifer Moreno on behalf of State Superintendent of Public Instruction Tom Torlakson. The superintendent supports the governor's proposal to include local libraries in Scenic. Libraries are often where students go for internet access when they do not have internet access at home. Given our world and education system is increasingly online, the SPI believes this is an important investment for our communities and students. Thank you.
Thank you.
Louis Fox again from Scenic. I would note that I've been the CEO of Scenic for a couple of years. Prior to that, as a faculty member at the University of Washington and Duke. I helped work on state networks around the country, where we were able to put in place networks similar to Scenic, state networks, most of which included libraries. So when I started at Scenic, I was really surprised to see that my own network didn't include public libraries, and this has been a main focus over the last couple of years in working with libraries and library systems. We launched 3 pilots. San Francisco Public Peninsula that you heard about, and libraries throughout the Central Valley. In every case, we've been able to get at least a gigabit or better into libraries, and in most instances that is increasing the bandwidth at those libraries 100-fold, if not more, and we've been able to decrease the costs significantly. And like the members of Scenic, the staff and leadership of Scenic would welcome having the libraries as one of our associates.
Thank you. Questions, comments from the committee? It appears to me that the LAO does raise some legitimate concerns, but overall I agree with the governor and with the libraries that this is, as Mr. Dillon indicated, I mean, when you put it in the context of the over $40 million reduction in state funding for local library programs, that this is a fairly modest infrastructure, and what I hear library folks describing as a game changer for connecting libraries, many libraries, not all libraries, but many libraries throughout the state to this Scenic backbone. It seems to be a good investment in a high-speed infrastructure that's much cheaper than some other high-speed projects that the governor is pursuing. It seems to address a clear need that even though we don't reach all libraries, that it is a significant step forward for the state to demonstrate that it's a state priority to bring all of our communities up to this high-speed access for the Internet. It seems to be working for our schools, our UCs, CSUs, and community colleges, and I believe that it's not the final solution, and we do need to continue to address these last-mile connection issues and how to finance them. But this seems to be a strong commitment in the right direction. But at the same time, I think Mr. Ting and others had raised with the committee some legitimate questions about how we want to monitor how this program is carried out, and so I would, as the chair's recommendation, that we approve the governor's proposal with the placeholder budget bill language requiring an annual report describing the implementation of this project, including how many libraries are participating, how the participating libraries' technology costs and internet speeds have changed due to the project, how the $1 million in grants were used, and a more thorough assessment of the costs associated with upgrading library systems to gain the maximum benefit of the Scenic project.
I would move that. I would move the recommendation as the chair described.
Second. Roll call, please.
Mr. Murasucci?
Aye.
Ms. Skinner?
Aye.
Mr. Ting?
Aye. And just for the record, I should clarify that as the chair of the Budget Committee, in the absence of a subcommittee member, the Budget Committee chair can take the place, serves as the alternate of a subcommittee absent member. Any other comments? Yes.
Make a very brief comment. Your additions were good for this item. I support the item strongly, and while we're loath to discuss anything as restorations of funding, since we know that pre-recession potentially some different aspects of the state budget weren't sustainable, I think that it's that our cuts to libraries have been particularly there's an attitude now that somehow we don't need these kinds of community services, and that books perhaps are not even necessary. We all have these devices, and yet we know that still a good percent of the population doesn't. And independent of whether you have access to internet or access to computers or whatever, libraries are still a very important place to get information, to get assistance in terms of how to seek out information. Just using websites for searches, garbage in, garbage out. So libraries serve such an essential function, and for many of us, they were our refuge. Growing up, the library saved my life. Living in a household of 11 people, the library was the only quiet place that I could do homework. It was the only place so libraries are essential, and we need to support them.
Why don't we move on then to our next item, issue number 3, capital outlay proposal. This is for the governor's proposal to change the Cal State University capital outlay process by shifting bond debt service payments into CSU's main appropriation. I'd like to invite representatives from the Department of Finance, LAO, and Mr. Storm from Cal State University, as well as Mr. Sanwan from Cal State University. Thank you. Mr. Azamania.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've provided a handout that includes an outline of this presentation. The California State University reports that it faces significant infrastructure challenges in coming years, including a large number of high-priority capital renewal and deferred maintenance projects. The administration's intent is to approach these challenges in a way that is consistent with past actions to provide the university with discretion to determine how best to use limited state resources to meet state goals. The governor's budget creates a mechanism for the CSU to address its infrastructure needs by shifting additional responsibility to the university to use its available resources to fund all of its costs, including those related to both operations and infrastructure. We also note that the components of this proposal are consistent with the requests submitted to Finance in the fall by the university. The budget makes 4 separate changes that are each related to this new approach. First, the budget includes a single general fund appropriation for operations and infrastructure. In 2014-15, this appropriation is increased by $142 million pursuant to the administration's multi-year funding plan, and by $297 million, recognizing that the university will begin to make debt service payments on bonds issued by the state for university projects. The administration's multi-year funding plan provides the CSU with an increase equivalent to the amount provided to the UC in a given year. In 2014-15, the UC will receive a 5% increase on all of its general fund resources, including those funds the UC is now using to pay the costs of debt service on state bonds. If the state were to fund the CSU's debt service costs separately from its operating costs, the administration would instead provide the CSU with an augmentation of $132 million in 2014-15, based on a 5% increase on the UC's general fund resources, excluding those funds used to support state debt service. Second, the budget expresses the administration's intent to increase funding for the university through this appropriation in future years. Under the administration's proposal, the legislature and the governor will continue to determine how to adjust this appropriation on an annual basis in future years. The administration's intent is that the appropriation would grow pursuant to the multi-year funding plan, which proposes augmentations of $120 million in 2015-16 and $124 million in 2016-17. The administration would also increase this appropriation by $7 million in 2015-16, $8 million in 2016-17, and $5 million in 2017-18 to fund state lease revenue bond rental payments the university will begin making in those years for projects authorized prior to the Budget Act of 2013. Third, the budget provides the CSU with additional authority to use general fund appropriations to support infrastructure costs. Legislation accompanying the Budget Act authorizes the university to pledge general fund appropriations when issuing bonds to restructure lease revenue bonds issued by the state for university projects, which could result in reduced costs and allow the CSU to redirect funds for other priorities. as well as to pledge appropriations when issuing university bonds to fund new capital outlay and maintenance projects. The budget also provides the university with additional authority to fund capital outlay projects on a pay-as-you-go basis. Existing law already authorizes departments to use support appropriations to fund up to $610,000 in capital outlay costs, subject to approval by the Department of Finance. The state provided nearly identical authority to the UC beginning in 2013-14. The UC is required to seek authorization from the state before using general fund appropriations for infrastructure costs. The CSU would be required to seek that same authorization. Furthermore, in any given year, the CSU could use no more than 12% of its general fund appropriations, excluding the amounts necessary to make payments towards existing state debt for new capital outlay. Fourth, the budget gives the university greater authority in implementing its infrastructure costs, which could also reduce the university's costs. It would authorize the state fire marshal to delegate enforcement of building standards to university employees. Existing law already authorizes the fire marshal to delegate enforcement to UC employees for UC projects. It would also authorize the university to use one contract to perform multiple projects at multiple campuses. Existing law authorizes the CSU to use one contract to perform multiple projects only if those projects are at a single campus. And finally, it would authorize the university to provide public notice of bids for contracts online rather than in print newspapers. Existing law already provides this authority to some other state agencies, including the Department of Transportation. The approach described here in these four components eliminates a wall between funds for CSU operations and funds for CSU capital outlay. The current separation can undermine the state's efforts to allocate resources to meet state goals. For example, the university recently conducted a survey of department chairs at each of its campuses to determine the reason why campuses are not offering enough sections of certain bottleneck courses, thereby increasing the time it takes many students to complete their degrees. Time to degree is one of the outcomes the university is now reporting to the state. The department chairs cited a lack of classroom space as one reason for the identified bottlenecks. Providing funding to the university restricted for operating costs would do little to address this challenge. In closing, the proposed approach allows the governor and the legislature to focus its attention on the outcomes that have been identified as priorities, and it allows the university, based on its experience and expertise in managing instructional programs, to determine the appropriate allocation of resources. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, LAO.
Judy Hyman, Legislative Analyst Office. We have a number of concerns with this proposal. First, we don't think that the rationale is strong. While the administration suggests that the purpose of this proposal is to give the university more flexibility to better make choices that would address state needs, we think the problem isn't that they haven't had flexibility. The problem with their capital outlay situation is that there has been no capital outlay funding over the last several years. There hasn't been a general obligation bond for a number of years, and lease revenue bond funding has been quite minimal. So this doesn't really address that problem. In addition, the proposal is predicated on the legislature giving up significant authority, including its role in determining how much higher education funding should be spent on the operating budget versus the capital side, its ability to plan for infrastructure spending statewide, not just in higher education, and to prioritize funding among different program areas. The proposal does include notification to the legislature through the Joint Legislative Budget Committee, but that committee typically has been used for technical adjustments, not for big policy decisions like this. And also, using that process would reduce transparency significantly because projects wouldn't be discussed in public hearings. Second, the amount of funding is not linked with any assessment of ongoing need. And in fact, CSU has already identified a shortfall of $40 million in funding existing debt service commitments within the next 2 years under the governor's proposed funding level. So initially, the funding amount appears to be too little. In the long run, it could even be too much, depending on, as bonds are paid off and needs change. But the administration has presented no assessment of ongoing needs. As far as addressing the problem, CSU initially said that it would use the proposed authority to begin addressing its $1.8 billion deferred maintenance backlog. But upon further analysis, the Chancellor's office has said it likely couldn't even begin to address those needs for another 8 years or more. So given the lack of a compelling policy rationale, reduction in the legislature's authority, concerns about the funding level, and the fact that it doesn't address the needs. In fact, I think you'll see in CSU's presentation that even with a $100 million increase in ongoing funding for capital outlay, they would very quickly come back to the same deferred maintenance levels that they have now. We recommend that you reject this proposal. We recognize the universities have some serious capital outlay needs, especially with respect to deferred maintenance, and if additional funding is available, it may revise, or if you decide to redirect some one-time or ongoing funding from other governors' proposals, you could consider directly funding some CSU capital outlay projects through pay-as-you-go or state lease revenue bonds. Also, in a recent report on maintenance in higher education facilities, we recommended that you ask the universities to submit maintenance plans with specific proposals to address their backlogs and to avoid building up future deferred maintenance backlogs. And that's another thing you could consider. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd like to welcome the representatives from the California State University.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Ryan Storm, I'm the Interim Assistant Vice Chancellor for Budget. We have a little presentation we'd like to share with you. It's this red one here. What we'd like to do is kind of spell out exactly where we are in our capital program right now and give you some comments and thoughts about the governor's proposal.
Thank you. Vice Ann Williams, Cal State University. The first slide does summarize what has been included in your overview, identifying that we have typically used general obligation bond funds, State Public Works Board bond funds for capital outlay, and then we have very limited authority to use operating funds currently. So this proposal would be a significant change to that existing policy. The second slide is our historical state capital outlay funding, with the blue bars shows how heavily reliant we have been on general obligation bond funds. And you can see that the last one was approved in 2006. That was a 2-year bond funded 2006-07 and 2007-08. And then it declined so that we're really only using leftover general obligation bond funds like what was proposed for the equipment projects in item 3 earlier in this agenda. The red bars are the Public Works Board lease revenue bond funds that the legislature has approved, so those were not required to be approved by the voters, and they've been used primarily for economic stimulus. You can see in 2002 and then again in 2008, 9, and a few years since then. And the high point in our funding was in 2002 at about $475 million, short of what has been the average if you look at 2006, 7, 7, 8 of about $350. The difficulty with the Public Works Board bonds, the ones in red, are that we aren't able to use those very easily for infrastructure. And certainly that's been a priority for the CSU to focus in on with recent problems in the system with our central utility plants and distribution. The next slide, this is number 4, shows that same historical capital outlay funding, and the black bars off to the right are what is in the campus's 5-year plans, showing our need, our requests from campuses for capital projects. And there is an overlap between what's in our deferred maintenance backlog of the $1.8 billion and these capital needs. So when we renovate a project, renovate a building, we would address the deferred maintenance in that building. That's where the overlap is in renovations. But it shows, even with our trustees setting forth criteria for priority setting, limiting the number of projects campuses can request, that there's still a significant unfunded need. And in that first year, 14-15, the limitations that the trustees have on campus requests is why it's less than $500 million.
This next slide shows the components of the Department of Finance capital budget proposal that Mr. Osmina talked about and some of our concerns. The key point that I want to leave with you is that under this proposal we are statutorily equipped to self-determine the repair, the renovation, and construction of any facility on our campuses, which is a great thing. And that would go on forever. It'd be a fantastic tool that we would have. That's because the Chancellor's Office team has worked very closely with Finance, and we appreciate their good work in addressing a lot of our issues, and to ensure that we have the correct statutory flexibilities and tools needed so that we can progress on this proposal. However, not all of our funding concerns have been resolved, and we'll talk about that on the next slide or two. The next slide, I want to point your eye to the top half of this slide. And what this demonstrates really is the amount of money that it is currently required to cover the existing debt service bonds that are outstanding. And it shows this debt over time. So if you look at the purple line there, that's kind of how much we owe on a per year basis. And you can see it fluctuates. There's this yo-yo effect, and it's because there's variable rates and different times that these bonds are sold, et cetera. The red solid line, that's around the $300 million mark, that's where the governor's proposal kicks in and says, hey, we're going to give you $297 million, and we're going to leave it with you forevermore. Okay? And then what happens is that beginning in 14-15 here, you can see that as time marches on up to 16-17, we have a gap where CSU is responsible for covering that debt service, presumably out of the multi-year funding monies. Dips back down below the red line, we have some savings, and then we have another spike later out, so that we are, by 22-23, we're clear of this spike in which the support budget needs to take care of or cover those debt service costs. Want to go ahead and do the second half?
Sure. Yeah. So in the bottom of that slide, it shows that once we clear these spikes at about 2022, you'll see the second dotted line, then we'd have more ease of these yo-yos effect and the difficulty in balancing the needs of our support budget, and could potentially do financing. So the area that's below the red solid line and above the the purple line would be what we would use for financing ability. And in our ability to finance projects, that would impact, as Ms. Hyman mentioned, that in 2024, 2023, you see the reduction in the deferred maintenance, the projected deferred maintenance backlog in that blue. So we'd finally be able to impact the deferred maintenance backlog. And the black lines of the deferred maintenance backlog off to the left shows that, in the 2004, 5, 6, we were able to stem the growth of the deferred maintenance backlog. There was some concern by the legislature back then. In the 90s, we got some one-time funds from general fund to address deferred maintenance. And then in the 2000s, we started using general obligation bond funds to address renewal needs. So that really helped us. But with the absence of general obligation bonds, we've just been on the climb. The next graph, this resource level to fund GEO-bond and peak debt payments, shows the solid line now going to the top of the purple at about $340 million. So it shows that if we were able to secure enough resources to fund the peak of all the existing debt service, then we would be able to finance projects sooner. And this would show then in the green bars off to the bottom that we would be able to finance maybe three times in order to reduce the backlog. And so you can see the administration's proposal is still in the blue, and the green lines that show up in the bottom block for the deferred maintenance. And so it results in a lower backlog by about $500 million compared to the administration's proposal out in 2023. And just taking that example once more to show the resource level of $400 million. That would be the next graph, resource level to $100 million more than the $297 proposed by the administration would bring us up to just under $400. And it would show that in the bottom histogram for deferred maintenance, it effectively allows us to reduce the backlog by $1.3 billion. So that blue bar, just short of $3 billion compared to the green bar next to it. It's about a $1.3 billion less. So certainly having more money allows us to do more, along with the authority that is proposed by the administration.